Hello and welcome to the PMP webinar. Thank you for signing on to the webinar and I welcome you all to the session. In today's webinar, we are going to talk about project scope management. Now, as you know, project scope management is one of the important knowledge areas of the 10 knowledge areas that we have in PMBOK 6th edition. If you compare the project scope management with the PMBOK 5th edition, the previous one, there hasn't been much of a change in this particular knowledge area, except addition of few tools and techniques, which we will talk about. And of course, there are certain tailoring considerations that are added, which we will also be touching upon as a part of this webinar. Now, as this is a webinar and we may not be able to cover each and every topic in depth, but that is covered as a part of the training. So once you enroll for the PMP workshop, PMP training program, you will be able to get in-depth knowledge about the topics that we're going to cover under project scope management, especially around all the processes that we have within the scope management and with lots of examples and the kind of deliverables that we talk about as a part of this knowledge area. But in today's webinar, I'm sure I'll be able to give you overview on the scope management and what are the different processes that are associated with the scope management. So with this agenda, let's get started with project scope management. So project scope management is one of the knowledge areas that we have out of the 10 knowledge areas that we cover as a part of PMBOK. When you prepare for PMP examination, definitely you will be referring to the latest edition of which is PMBOK 6th edition. And today's webinar and the training is based on the latest PMBOK, which is 6th edition itself. There are total 49 processes. There are total 5 different process groups that we talk about and 10 knowledge areas. So when you appear for the exam and when you prepare for the PMP certification, you basically study all of these. You will study 10 knowledge areas, 49 processes, and 5 different process groups. One of the knowledge areas today that we're covering as a part of this webinar in terms of giving you the high level overview is the scope management. Now, as a part of scope management, I'm sure you may have a lot of basic questions, fundamental questions around this knowledge area, which I'm sure you will be able to get answer to some of those. Largely, as you would know, and you would agree that the scope management process covers about how we define the scope on the project, how we go about controlling it, and it's more from the point of view of the kind of output that we are trying to deliver by the end of the project. What outcomes are we trying to achieve for our stakeholders? And what benefits of the project that we are trying to help our stakeholder achieve, or the result or the outcome that we are working for? If you really look at whenever we work on any project, as a result of the project, what we get by the end of the project is some deliverable. That deliverable could be in the form of some physical product that you're launching in the market, or that deliverable could be in the form of some service or some result that you're producing. And that result or that product is going to ultimately help your stakeholders achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve through that. There could be various outcomes that they want to achieve, by the way. For example, if you are launching some product in the market for your stakeholders, through which they might want to achieve the customer satisfaction. So that is outcome of the product that you are trying to work for your stakeholders. Outcomes are defined by stakeholders. Deliverables are worked upon by the team and they ensure that they produce the deliverables in line with the expectations that are agreed upon between the team and the stakeholders. And obviously, as a team, we should also be knowing the kind of benefits that the project offers to the stakeholders. That's how these three things are interlinked with each other. Now, when we talk about scope, obviously we have to look into the product scope and the project scope. Now, there is a product life cycle and there is a project life cycle. And just to give you an idea about the product life cycle, which is definitely much, much bigger, much, much lengthier than the project life cycle. But obviously, when we produce any product, we basically undertake some project and the outcome of that project is your product. But once you start working on that product, the product life cycle is much, much longer. And within life cycle of a product, you might be undertaking multiple projects. So there is a project scope. So for example, you have a product which you have already launched in the market, and now you have undertaken a small project to build some enhancement on the top of that project. So let's say you are introducing the CRM sales management software in the market. It's already there in the market. you have defined that scope of the product, what all things that you want to cover as a part of that product offering in the market based on the category it serves in. For example, if it is in a sales management, then obviously you would like to build the capabilities which will help your customers utilize your product or use your product in such a way that they can fulfill their needs and requirements. So you'll ensure that your product is capable enough to fulfill all that scope from the customer's point of view. Now, when we talk about a project, now project you could undertake for various purposes. One of the purpose is your product is already in the market and now you want to build some small enhancement on the top of that. So you might undertake a small project just to build that small enhancement, and then you would complete that project within 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, whatever the time period that is agreed between you and the customer. So you have a project scope. In this case, it is whatever the enhancement that you have agreed, and you have a product scope, which is obviously based on the product that you're building to be launched in the market. Now, if you talk about the scope management, it will obviously cover product scope, project scope, depending on what for you're working on. Now, let's talk about certain tailoring considerations from the scope management point of view. And this is what exactly PMI has done from the sixth edition. There are certain tailoring considerations that are being considered for each of the knowledge areas. Now, from exam point of view as well, this is important to know what are the tailoring consideration under scope management. We always say that one size solution doesn't fit all. So we'll have to tailor the process that we are working on. So if I have to work on a scope management, I might have to tailor the process based on the context I'm working in. And that really differs. If you're working in a banking industry, if you work in FMCG industry, fast moving consumer goods, if you're working in e-commerce industry, pharmaceutical industry, manufacturing. So in each of these industries, the kind of work that you may be working on could differ. The context is different. You're dealing with different kinds of stakeholders. So it's very important for us to tailor the process based on the context that you're working in. So knowledge and requirements management, how are you going to ensure that the knowledge is gathered, is documented? And based on that, you would have to then think about the kind of requirements that you would like to work upon. How are you going to validate and control your scope? Now, depending on the kind of context that you work in, you would decide in terms of defining the acceptance criteria, in terms of agreeing upon how and when my customer would accept the deliverables by the end of each phase or by the end of whatever the milestone that is agreed between you and the customers. So we can certainly tailor around this aspect as well. You would also need to define the development approach. How would you like to build this product or project or some result or service that you are trying to produce by the end of that project? People might go by an agile way, or you would like to stick around the waterfall way, or some project lifecycle or product lifecycle that you would agree upon between you and the stakeholders. So what's the development approach? And that's going to differ. If you're working in research and development, the development approach could be completely different than if you're working on producing some product to be launched in the market. Stability of requirements. If the changes that are expected in the product that you're developing are very high, obviously you might not be able to just go in a traditional way. You might need to have more interactions with customer, more feedback loops, so that you can pick up those changes, you can validate your requirements more frequently, and you will be able to manage those changes in the requirements effectively. Otherwise, you would have a huge impact on the architecture, on the design that you may have already created if the changes come towards late in the cycle. And of course, the governance. The complexity of project would also define the kind of governance framework that you want to establish on project. Whether you would like to have got weekly meetings with your stakeholders, fortnightly discussions, escalation metrics, what kind of a governance that you want to establish on the project that you're working on. From scope point of view, definitely it's important to know how are you going to manage change on the project. We have to tailor the process based on these considerations. Now, once you've done the tailoring of the process, then you get on to the project scope management. Now, here is a question from Satish, and he's asking about what is the difference between the PMBOK 5th edition and PMBOK 6th edition scope management process. So I guess, as I mentioned earlier, there is no much of a difference between these two. Of course, the changes that I've done in PMBOK 6th and 5th edition from scope management point of view, Of course, there are certain changes that have been done in the form of tools and techniques, in the form of certain suggestions, like use of certain techniques which are additionally mentioned, which we will touch upon a bit on this webinar. But largely, you will find that the scope management is more or less intact. Of course, the tailoring considerations are added. And more importantly, what is also done in general in comparison with the fifth edition is the touch of agile. So in each of these areas, the agile touch is given. Like from scope management point of view, I would say, how do we really manage scope in agile project and how do we do it in the predictive life cycle? So we have got a predictive life cycle and we have adaptive life cycles, as you might have already heard about. So traditionally, we more use the predictive life cycle. The way scope is managed in predictive life cycle is different than the way it is managed in the adaptive life cycle. So those aspects are also covered largely as a part of this new PMBOK edition. But changes are subtle in comparison with some of the other knowledge areas. So I hope that gives you some idea. All right, thank you for the confirmation. Let's keep moving about scope management processes. Now, under each of these knowledge areas, you will find various processes as a part of these knowledge areas. Talking about scope management, we start with plan scope management, and this is where largely we focus on how to plan the scope management activities on project. Collecting requirements is definitely one of the important process where we reach out to the stakeholders to identify their needs and requirements based on the project or product that we are working on. Then, based on the requirements that we have gathered, we define scope and we ensure that whatever is defined in the scope, we only work on those items and not something which is not part of scope. Creating WBS process certainly gives us an idea about what are the low level activities, tasks, packages, work packages that we have to work upon. And decomposition is one of the techniques that is used while creating WBS. So creation of WBS is definitely one of the important processes within the scope management. Then we have to validate scope against the acceptance criteria that is defined between you and the customer. For each deliverable that you're producing by the end of each phase in project or product lifecycle, it's important to define very clearly the acceptance criteria. And then lastly, we have got control scope. And this is where we basically see how do we control effectively the changes that might happen to the scope and how do we go about managing those changes. So these are the 6 processes that we have within scope management. Let's get on to each of these and we'll do a bit of a deep dive into each of these processes in terms of understanding what is it first of all, what are some of the inputs that we have to consider, what tools and techniques can we use on that process, and what kind of output can we expect out of it. So let's start with the first one, which is about plan scope management. And as the name says, plan scope management is all about we have to basically define our approach. How are we going to go about managing scope on project? So it's largely about defining that approach. Like in terms of how are we going to define the product scope? How are we going to validate it against the acceptance criteria? How the scope is going to be controlled? How changes on the or to the scope are going to be managed? So all of those approaches are basically covered as a part of the scope management plan. And certainly, this is one of the important documents from the point of view of if there is any confusion around like how we should manage change, then I can just go and refer to this document. Even if I'm new on project and if I wouldn't know how to do that, this document will certainly give me an idea about how I supposed to be validate scope against the acceptance criteria. So what is the overall approach that is being agreed between the team and customer? So that guidance and the direction is what this provides. So that's about the scope management. Now, how do we really create this kind of a document? For that, we'll have to refer to certain inputs. The first is, of course, the project charter. Since we are defining the approach, it's important for us to refer to the project charter in terms of understanding the high level scope that is mentioned there in the project charter. We have to also refer to project management plan. Now, project management plan is a subsidiary management plan. So it encompasses various plans like for example, quality management plan. So largely we refer to the quality management plan when we work on the scope management plan because quality will give you inputs about kind of standards that you want to follow while working or creating on that product or service or some result that you're working on through that project. So it's very important for us to refer to that or kind of project lifecycle that you would like to follow or the development approach that is being agreed upon. So all of that would come from there. Organizational process assets. So this will give us an idea about what kind of internal standards that you would like to follow, what kind of templates that you would refer to, etc. Enterprise environmental factors, you would refer to certain internal and external factors. Like, for example, if I'm building on the CRM sales management software, I would also like to look into some of the market products and see what is there in those products, and would there be any gap between what's there, what's available already, and what we would like to build. So those market factors or the products available in the market would also have an impact on the overall plan that you're creating for managing scope. Now, once you have a plan in place, certainly you need to be using certain tools and techniques while creating this plan itself. The first is, of course, expert judgment. You can talk to the people who have been doing this for quite a while. These people will certainly give us an idea about how to do it. Meetings, we can organize various meetings in order to engage right stakeholders. We can also gather data and sort of do the discussions around it. So these couple of techniques will certainly help us. And what do we expect by the end of scope management plan really? What we get ultimately is the scope management plan is what we get as an output. So I would know how the scope is going to be managed on this project by referring to this plan. And I would also get requirement management plan. How am I going to manage requirements on the project, right from gathering requirements, right from what kind of techniques and tools am I going to use, etc. Who are the stakeholders am I going to engage? So all of those answers would come from the requirements management plan, including the traceability of the requirements. So that's about creating the plan. So once we have a plan in place, we know the approach on this project that's going to be followed when it comes to managing scope. Then I start working on the next process, which is collect requirements. As a part of collect requirement process, what do I have to do really? So this is a process where we basically ensure that we gather all the needs and the requirements of customers, which will help in meeting the objectives of the project that we're working on. So it could be manufacturing some product that you are working on, or coming up with some result or some process or some service that you're trying to launch in the market. So all of that could be a part of the collect requirements, depending on the kind of objective that you have defined. So this will certainly give us an idea about how to define the scope of the product or project that we are working on. Before we define the scope, it's important to gather requirements. And in order to do that, we'll have to use certain tools and techniques. We have to refer to certain artifacts which are already created on the project by this time. So let's get on to it. What kind of tools and techniques should we be using? So before we get on to the tools and techniques, first of all, we need to refer to certain artifacts which I was just now mentioning to you about. Like project charter will help us knowing the high level scope of the project. And of course, I would also know who are some of the stakeholders I need to reach out to. Project management plan, largely, as I said, scope management plan, requirements management plan, stakeholder engagement plan. Some of these plans would be definitely useful to me while working on collecting requirements. Project documents. So I would also need to refer to certain project documents like maybe assumption log or lesson learned. If there is any lesson previously learned, and if I want to ensure that those mistakes wouldn't be occurring again. So that's very important. I would also need stakeholder register, which is very important because that will give me the list of stakeholders whom I need to engage. I would also need to refer to business documents. And one of the most important document would be business case, because business case will help me in understanding the background, context, how this project is going to give benefit to my customer, etc., about investment impacts, all of that. Now, most of the times there is always the vendor engagement on the projects, something on the other hand. So I would need to know the agreements. And those agreements will also give me an idea about either the kind of scope impact that would have on this project, what kind of a contribution the vendor would have on this, and stakeholders as well. Enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets would be here as well, pertaining to collect requirements. What kind of a templates do I need to use? What kind of techniques do I need to use? So all of that would come from here when I work on collect requirements. So these are some of the inputs that I would need to refer to. Now, what kind of tools and techniques would help me when I start gathering requirements on the project? One of the important tools would be expert judgment. So I would reach out to people who have done this in the past. I would talk to them. I would try to understand their perspectives, their learnings, and I will definitely engage them in order to gather scope. So maybe, for example, business analyst would be one of the best examples. So we have people who have been working in business analysis for few years and they know how to conduct certain workshops, facilitated group workshops, or conduct surveys or interviews, etc. So I would reach out to them. In terms of gathering data, again, there are various ways through which I do that. One of the way could be brainstorming sessions. I would conduct face-to-face interviews. And the another way could be also benchmarking. So as I said, if I'm working on a CRM software for sales management, I would benchmark it against some well-known product in the market, reputed product in the market, and to then try to find out gaps. And that will help me in analyzing the data and obviously gather more data. Decision making is definitely one of the important tools that we use. And there could be various small techniques that are used in decision making, like simple voting technique, just so that everybody's engaged, everybody's involved. There could be multi-criteria decision analysis based on the various criterias, how those criterias would impact the decision: cost, quality, resource availability. So many of these criterias would be available for us to refer to while making decisions. Definitely team skills and interpersonal skills, like for example, whether do we have skills in the team to conducting workshops like nominal group technique or observations and conversations with some senior folks, and even do we have the facilitation skills within our team members so that facilitated workshops could be conducted. And all of these would have certainly an impact. Data representations like affinity diagram could be one of the examples in data representation. Context diagrams, prototypes. So these are some of the techniques which will definitely help you in engaging your stakeholders from whom you will be gathering data and, of course, the requirements, related requirements on the project. All right. So what do we get by the end of collect requirement process in the form of output? You will get requirements, documentation. So requirement documentation would have whatever the template which is used in your organization, you would have that, and requirement traceability metrics. These are the couple of outputs that we can think of getting out of this process. So requirement documentation is where all the requirements are captured, and we have traceability metrics, and that's where we try to see how do we establish traceability of that requirement through the project life cycle. So there could be a backward traceability or a forward traceability. We see to it that once we pick up that requirement from the requirement specification document, we are analyzing it, we're designing it, coding is happening, testing is happening, and then it's a part of the implementation plan and it's deployed successfully. So that's the forward traceability. Similarly, we can do the backward traceability as well. Let's move on to define scope process. So once we have defined the requirement or scope management plan, once we've gathered requirements, then based on the requirements, we have to define scope. So how do we do that, and what happens largely as a part of this? So as part of the defining scope, you would see that basically we're trying to describe what we're going to build, what we're going to create as a part of this project and product. So whatever the product outcome or result that you're trying to achieve here, now you're going to define them together with stakeholders and you're going to be on the same page about what it is like. And this is where you'll also be capturing about the in scope and out scope items. What is in scope as a part of this project? What is not part of this project? So for example, if you are producing some software and that software is supporting only one language, which is English, so we need to be explicitly mentioning about that. Or if it is supporting two languages, so we have to mention explicitly about that. And it doesn't support beyond these two languages or three languages, which is being agreed between you and the customer. Acceptance criteria for each of the deliverables that we produce by the end of each phase needs to be also explicitly captured. For example, when we talk about as a part of the acceptance criteria, when you come up with the requirement specification document as one of the deliverables, so then has to be some acceptance criteria agreed between when the customer will sign off that document when it fulfills certain acceptance criteria. So those needs to be explicitly put down here as a part of defining scope. What do we use really when it comes to the input to defining scope process? We refer to the project charter, project management plan, certain documents, enterprise environmental factors, and organizational process assets. So in terms of project management plan, we'll refer to scope management plan in particular. And in terms of certain project documents, Few examples that I gave, like assumption log. If there is any assumption around when we try to define scope, we'll have to explicitly mention about that assumption. And that really helps us. And we can also refer to requirements documentation, things like risk register, etc. So those are also very useful to refer to while working on this process. What kind of tools and techniques can we use? Expert judgment is one such a technique which is used in most of the processes that we work on. It's very useful. We can use decision making, like few things that I mentioned earlier as well, multi-criteria decision analysis kind of a thing. Data analysis, again, trying to find out what are the options that we have and how we can choose the best possible option. So sort of an alternative analysis. Interpersonal and team skills. So this is where your facilitation skills will come into picture. Even if you want to run the meeting, you need those skills, without which you won't be able to do that. And product analysis, in order to find out what is in scope and out of the scope of the product and the one that we are building. So we have to do the analysis of the product. What do we expect by the end of this process? By the end of this process, we should have project scope statement with us. So project scope statement will define ultimately about that product or a project that we're working on, and largely what we want to achieve or what we want to build in that product or the project. And certain project documents will get updated as well. Like, for example, during your experience of defining scope, if you come across any assumption, you would like to log that. You want to also update requirement documentation. If in case there has been any change that you observed, you need to also go back and do that. Requirement traceability metrics needs to be updated, because now you have identified all the requirements, put it into traceability. So you can update that if there is impact at all. And stakeholder register, based on your interaction with stakeholder. If you come across any change, then you would need to also update that. So now we have defined the scope management plan. We have started gathering requirements. Based on the requirements, we have also created sort of a scope for that product or the project that we're working on. It's time now for us to break down that into smaller packages, which will make our life easy to work on. And that's a part of your Create WBS. So WBS is your work breakdown structure. And as a part of work breakdown structure, what you try to achieve really. When we break down work into something which is more manageable, something which is easy to estimate, something which is easy to plan, and most importantly, based on this work breakdown structure, we actually come up with dependencies, we come up with schedule, we come up with estimate. So it's definitely very important for us to work upon. So work breakdown structure is one of the important processes within the project management. And we need to make sure each work package that we create is broken down at such a level that we can estimate it. It's not a large chunk of requirement, it's a small chunk of requirement. So if you're working on a hardware part, then you should be able to break it down into the smaller components, smaller deliverables, so that you can estimate in terms of networking requirements, in terms of hardware, server requirements, in terms of the other middlewares that you would need to build that. So those needs to be very clearly defined so that we can estimate for each of these things what's the time required, what's the money required, and then we can derive the schedule and budget out of it. So to do that, we need to certainly refer to certain inputs, project management plan, project documents, some of the documents which I mentioned earlier as well, enterprise environmental factors, and the OPAs or organizational process assets. Like, for example, when we create WBS, there are various ways of creating WBS. So you can have a phased way. You can divide your entire project into various phases, and you can just go on, like, for example, requirement as a phase, design as a phase, development as a phase. And within each of these phases, you try to break down your scope items into the smaller, more manageable packages. So if it is a requirement, then you would basically come up with how are you going to manage your requirements, requirement specification document. So that is one of the deliverables. How are you going to collect requirements? What are the various techniques? Who is going to work on each of these? So you try to define these deliverables as small as possible, which we can then assign to people later on in the form of tasks. And then obviously it will be also useful when we estimate things as well. What kind of tools and techniques can we use? I think when it comes to create WBS, there are a couple of things that we can do. Most important technique here is decomposition. Now, as the name itself says, decomposition is all about breaking down your larger piece of requirement into the smaller ones. So whatever the scope item that you're working on, just try to break it off into the smaller pieces, which is like we call it as a work package. And that work package is small enough to be completed within maybe around 40 hours or so. So that's a rule of 40 that they follow, but it could vary. So it could be 40 hours to 80 hours, something which we can estimate, something which is easy to learn about, and which will also help us in the form of inputs when it comes to estimation of schedule and the budget. Expert judgment, we can certainly engage certain SMEs into this and take their views as well. What we get by the end of this, we'll get scope baseline, and what we will get is the project documents updation. So project documents will get updated. The scope baseline is something which is very important because you would baseline your scope. Now we use a lot of different tools on the project. You might be using MS projects, you might be using, for example, Clarity. There are certain tools that are available, or simple people might be doing it in the Excel spreadsheets as well. So once we baseline the scope, then any change over and above would be considered as a new requirement, and it has to go through the change control board, etc. Whatever the process that is being agreed between you and the customer. And the project documents, again, some of the documents that I've already mentioned to you could be assumption log or could be the stakeholder list. So those will get updated as a result of this. So if we have to just quickly summarize what we've covered, we started off with the scope management plan as one of the processes. We defined it and we created that. Now we know the approach on the project about managing scope. Then we started off with how are we going to collect requirements on the project, what kind of inputs we can refer to, what kind of tools and techniques we can refer to, etc. Based on that, we define scope of the project. So I have a scope baseline now, and I also have a traceability metrics, etc. Now, all this information is going to be really useful when I do the next process, which is about validating scope. So validating scope is all about understanding whatever the deliverables that I have completed, whether those deliverables meet acceptance criteria or not. So there is something called as the acceptance process. And this acceptance process will certainly help us in increasing the probability of final product, service, or result acceptance. And this is clearly defined between you and the customers. For each deliverable that we are producing, what is the acceptance criteria? So if it is a high level design document that I'm producing on the project, when would my customer accept that, or when would my customer approve that high level design document? So I move on to the low level design document if you're working in a waterfall way. So validate scope is important process from that point of view. What we can use as part of input, of course, we need to refer to project management plan, especially scope, requirement, and the scope baseline. These three things are important from validate scope point of view. So I would refer to the requirement management plan and the scope baseline, of course. Project documents, like there are certain documents that we can refer to here. For example, lessons learned document, or if I have got a quality reports or certain requirement documentation, and most importantly, traceability metrics. I'll refer to the traceability metrics as well. Then I would have verified deliverable, which is the one that you have actually produced and verified, and work performance data. So work performance data would have the actual progress of the work that you're making on the project. Typically, work performance data is captured in the tool that you're using. So if you're using MS projects or if you're using Clarity, whichever the tool that you're using, your actual work performance data is captured. So what's your planned activities and what's your actual activities that you have completed? So all this data is captured as a part of that. What kind of tools and techniques can we use here? Especially in validating scope, you would have few things, couple of things at least that you can use. One is about inspection. So you are actually inspecting that, okay, there are certain acceptance criteria that are given by the customer, and I have already produced that deliverable. So does it really meet the acceptance criteria or not? So I'm doing these regular inspections, which will actually help me in getting closer and closer to the acceptance criteria of the deliverable that I'm producing. And obviously, decision making techniques would certainly help in terms of getting opinion from people as well. What do I get out of this? I would get the accepted deliverable. By the end of this process, I would know whether my customer have already accepted it, considering that this meets acceptance criteria or not. Work performance information. So work performance information will be one of the output. As I mentioned earlier, it will come from the tool. If there is any change at all during the review, during the inspection, typically what happens, you're showing the deliverable to the customer and you're trying to show that how it meets the acceptance criteria. But there could be change. There could be like based on what you have shown to the customer might just suggest you a few changes. So that might be a part of your change request, which will follow the change request cycle. And certain project documents will get updated, like lessons learned document or requirements document, or even for that matter, requirement traceability document would also get updated if required. So this is what we can expect out of validate scope process. So now that we have done, like we have come up with a plan, we have gathered requirements, we have defined the scope, we also validated requirements. It's important now for us to control that so that the scope creep can be avoided. Scope creep avoidance is very important, and that's where the project manager's role comes into picture, ensuring that the scope is defined so well that there is no need or the scope creep doesn't happen. So let's talk about last and the most important process, which is about control scope. As part of control scope, we'll look into, first of all, what is it really? This comes as a part of the monitoring process, and this is where we try to monitor status of the project and product scope. And whatever the changes that are there needs to be incorporated to the scope baseline, which is maintained throughout the project. As we've discussed already, that once we have defined the scope, we have to also come up with the scope baseline, right? So once it is baseline, once it is agreed, over and above, if there is any change, it has to go through a change process. So that's the part of your control scope and monitoring. What kind of inputs I need to refer to for this? I would need, of course, the project management plan. I would need project documents, work performance data, and OPAs. So all of these we have already discussed earlier as well. So like, for example, in this case, project documents, like I would need lessons learned documents, which will be very useful to me. And there are certain tools and techniques which will be useful, like data analysis. I would do the trend analysis, for example. I would also be able to do the alternative analysis, etc. And based on that, what I will get as a part of the control scope is the work performance. So work performance, this is where I will come to know about what's the kind of progress that I'm making on the project. Is it in line with what I have planned, or is it like I'm behind the schedule or ahead of the schedule, or how am I doing? Since we're talking about scope, then how am I doing with respect to the scope? Change requests, if there is any new change that the customer would like to introduce, so that will definitely be the output which will go to the process where the change is going to be processed. Project management plan will get updated if required. Project documents might get updated, stakeholder register, or for that matter, assumption log, traceability metrics. So any of these documents, wherever there is impact as a result of the control scope process, would need to be updated. So this covers all the processes that we have to cover as a part of the project scope management. So we have started with what is project scope management. We understood largely why it is required. And then I have also given you a bit of an idea around how the tailoring is done in scope management. And most importantly, why do we need to tailor a process? Not only that, we have also covered as a part of today's webinar, 6 different processes within scope management. So we have started with defining the plan for scope management. Then we started how we collect requirements, define scope, then we validate scope, we control scope, all of these different processes that we had covered as a part of the scope management in today's webinar. A couple of questions that you have asked, we have also touched upon those areas. But as I said in the beginning, that this is just the gist of it. In the actual training, we'll be doing deep dive into each of these areas. I'll be actually showing you the real templates of the project, like how the scope statement looks like. We'll be actually looking into the various work breakdown structures that we have. We'll be looking into the requirement specification document with lots of example, and that will give you certainly a depth of knowledge onto these areas, which will make you ready for the PMP examination as well. But I'm sure this session would have been very useful to you, especially from the overview of scope management as one of the knowledge areas within PMP 6th edition, PMBOK 6th edition point of view. So I would like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar, and I wish you all the best for your PMP examination. Thank you.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!